Everyone in the classroom laughed when the teacher poured a cup of hot coffee right over a student's head. He thought he had humiliated him in front of everyone and won. But just seconds later, the door opened, and his father, Chuck Norris, walked in. What happened next shocked them all. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The first morning at the new school carried the same mixture of noise and nervousness that belonged to any place where hundreds of teenagers crowded into the same building. The clang of lockers, the uneven chorus of voices, the squeak of sneakers on polished linoleum floors, all of it folded into a restless energy that pulsed through the corridors. For most students, it was just another day in the cycle of classes and bells. But for Dakota Allen Norris, it was the beginning of something he could not yet name. He walked with quiet focus, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his posture straight in a way that made him look more like an athlete entering competition than a boy simply trying to find his first classroom. He had inherited the bearing of his father, a calm that seemed unshakable, though he carried no desire to draw attention to himself. Still, he could feel eyes following him. Whispers swirled behind his steps, soft laughter cutting the air like tiny knives. Some voices said his name, others just muttered, but the sound reached him regardless. "That's him, right? Norris?" Someone breathed near the lockers, too quiet for a teacher to hear, but just loud enough to carry. Like the son of Chuck Norris, Dakota didn't flinch. He had known this would happen. He had grown up with the weight of the surname, the jokes, the myths, the exaggerated stories that traveled far beyond truth. For strangers, he was rarely himself. He was always the son of. He had long ago chosen not to argue, not to correct, not to explain. Silence was a better answer. As he passed a group of boys leaning casually against the wall, their smirks widened, eager to see if the rumors matched reality. They expected a reaction, a glare, a defensive word, some sign that they had gotten under his skin. Instead, Dakota kept walking, his eyes ahead, steady, measured. They laughed behind him. But the laughter had a thin edge, uncertain, as if they weren't sure why he hadn't bitten back. The morning unfolded in fragments of introductions and directions. Teachers read names from lists, students shuffled in and out of classrooms, and Dakota moved through it all with quiet determination. He sat near the middle rows, not hiding, but not seeking the front either. He listened more than he spoke, his notebook filling slowly with neat, deliberate handwriting. He caught the occasional glance from students trying to decide if they should risk talking to him, but the weight of expectation made them hesitate. Then came history class. The door creaked open into a room lined with faded maps and posters of battles long past. At the center stood Mr. Dalton, the teacher, a man whose presence commanded silence without needing to raise his voice. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, with thinning gray hair combed back in a way that made him look sterner than he might have been outside the classroom. His reputation in the school was firm. He was sharp, sarcastic, quick to remind students of their place. Dakota took a seat halfway back, unfolding his notebook again as the shuffle of students filled the room. He felt Dalton's eyes pause on him almost immediately. The teacher's gaze lingered just long enough to make clear that he had noticed the surname on the roster. "Dakota Norris," Dalton said, the name rolling off his tongue with a faint smile. The room shifted, small chuckles sparking like matches. "I think I've heard that one before. Any relation to, well, you know." More laughter rippled. Some students leaned forward, curious to see if Dakota would answer. But he only nodded once, calm and simple, without adding a word. Dalton smirked, clearly pleased by the reaction. "Interesting. Let's hope history class won't require roundhouse kicks to get through." The joke hung in the air, greeted with louder laughter this time. Phones buzzed under desks, students already messaging friends. The new kid, the Norris boy, had been singled out. Dakota's expression didn't change. He wrote down the date at the top of his page and focused on the lesson that had not yet begun. Inside, though, he recognized the tone. He had seen men like Dalton before, those who measured their strength not in kindness or fairness, but in how effectively they could belittle others. He understood that this was not just a joke. It was the opening move. The class continued. Dalton weaving through the lesson with a rhythm broken by occasional barbs. When Dakota answered a question, giving a measured response, Dalton tilted his head, exaggerated surprise in his voice. Ah, so the Norris boy does know something besides martial arts trivia. Shocking. The students laughed again, this time more freely, emboldened by the permission their teacher gave them. Dakota let the comment fall. His father had taught him the difference between responding out of pride and holding still out of discipline. In martial arts, the first move was not always to strike, but to remain unmoved. He kept that discipline here, though a part of him already understood that Dalton was marking him as a target. When the bell rang, students surged toward the door, chattering about lunch and assignments. But several lingered to glance back at Dakota. Some smirked, others only looked curious, as though waiting for him to prove whether he was a fighter or a fraud. Dakota packed his things slowly, not rushing, not dragging his feet, and stepped into the hall. The noise of the school swallowed him again. He felt the first weight of what was to come settling on his shoulders. This was no ordinary teacher making harmless jokes. Dalton had found a name he could use, a way to assert control and entertain himself at another's expense. Dakota knew the game would not stop here. The first spark had been struck, and the air around it was already heavy with the promise of fire. As he walked down the hallway, he caught the reflection of himself in the glass of a trophy case. Tall, steady, face calm. To anyone else, it might have looked like indifference. But deep inside, behind the quiet eyes, Dakota was preparing. He did not yet know how far Dalton would push or how much he would have to endure, but he carried with him the lessons that had been pressed into him since childhood. Stand tall, remain calm, never give away your control. The first chapter of his new school life had already shown him what kind of battlefield it would be. The laughter of classmates still echoed faintly behind him, and the smirk on Dalton's face lingered in his memory. But Dakota knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was only the beginning, and beginnings always carried the weight of what was to come. And as he stepped into the stream of students flowing toward the next class, the foundation of conflict had already been set, invisible to most but undeniable to him. The balance of power in that school had just shifted, though none of them realized yet how completely it would collapse. The second day did not feel any different at first. Dakota walked into the building as calmly as he had the morning before, his steps steady, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. The noise of the hallway surrounded him, slamming lockers, bursts of laughter, the endless shuffle of students moving from one class to another. To anyone watching closely, nothing seemed out of place. Yet beneath the surface of routine, the tension was already building. Yesterday had planted a seed, and now the soil of rumor and curiosity was beginning to nourish it. By the time Dakota reached the history classroom, the change in the air was already clear. Students turned their heads a little faster, whispered a little louder. The memory of Mr. Dalton's comments about his father had stuck, replayed and retold in the cafeteria, in the gym, in every corner where gossip thrived. The Norris boy had been made a spectacle, and now the crowd wanted more. Mr. Dalton stood at the front of the class, papers stacked neatly on his desk. His sharp eyes flicked toward Dakota as soon as he entered. There was no greeting, only a smirk that suggested the teacher had already prepared another performance. Dakota took his seat without looking up, pulling out his notebook, his expression as unreadable as ever. The lesson began as if nothing unusual was happening. Dalton spoke of ancient wars and the men who led them, his voice carrying authority that silenced the room. But soon the edge appeared, the same edge that had cut into Dakota the day before. "Let's see if our young celebrity can contribute," Dalton said suddenly, scanning the room before fixing his eyes on Dakota. "Dakota Norris, tell us, what was the primary cause of the Peloponnesian War?" The room shifted with anticipation. Dakota closed his notebook softly and answered in a calm, steady tone. He explained the rivalry between Athens and Sparta, the economic tensions, the fragile alliances that broke apart under the weight of ambition. His answer was clear and correct, spoken without hesitation. But Dalton tilted his head and smiled thinly. "Impressive," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Did your father teach you that between training sessions, or did you actually read the book?" The class erupted in laughter. A few students slapped their desks, others pulled out their phones under the table to type messages they thought were clever. Dakota did not smile, did not frown, did not break. He opened his notebook again and returned to writing. The laughter died down slowly, but the damage had been done. Dalton had reminded everyone who held the power in the room. Dakota had been used as a prop, a punchline, and though he had answered perfectly, the crowd left with the impression that he had been diminished. That was Dalton's gift twisting success into ridicule. As the week wore on, the pattern grew sharper. Each day, Dalton found new ways to chip at Dakota's presence. When Dakota answered quickly, Dalton mocked him for showing off. When he took a moment to think, Dalton accused him of hesitation. When his assignments were neat and thorough, Dalton suggested someone else must have helped him. And when they weren't perfect, he magnified every flaw until it seemed like failure. The students followed their teacher's lead. They laughed when Dalton laughed, whispered when he whispered, learned by example that to mock Dakota was to belong. The jokes spilled into the hallways. "Hey, Norris, where's your stunt double?" "Careful, don't roundhouse kick the vending machine." They weren't clever, but they didn't need to be. The weight of repetition was enough. Dakota absorbed it all in silence. His father had taught him that the hardest opponent was not the one who struck with fists, but the one who struck with words and waited for you to stumble. Anger was a trap. To lash out was to hand over your control. So Dakota remained still. His silence frustrated some of the students, who wanted him to break, to snap, to become the spectacle they were hoping for. But the silence also unsettled others. They saw in his calm something that resisted their laughter, something that made them uneasy even as they joined in. One afternoon, after Dalton had returned another assignment with a grade lower than it deserved, Dakota sat at his desk long after the bell rang, staring at the red mark at the top of the page. His work was correct, his arguments solid, yet Dalton had circled sentences with meaningless criticism. Weak structure, unclear, needs more thought. Words meant to cut, not to teach. A student passing by glanced at the paper and chuckled. "Guess being a Norris doesn't make you smart." He disappeared down the hall before Dakota could reply. Not that he would have. That evening, Dakota trained in the small gym his father had built behind the house. The punching bag swayed violently as he struck it again and again, his fists and feet moving with precision, his breath steady. Each blow released a fraction of the pressure that had built inside him. He remembered his father's words from long ago. "Discipline is doing what you must, even when your pride tells you otherwise." It was easy advice in the dojo. It was harder here, where humiliation wore a human face and walked into his classroom every day. The following morning brought more of the same. Dalton stood at the board, chalk in hand, when he turned suddenly to the class. "We're going to do something different today," he announced. "Pop quiz. Let's see who actually pays attention." The room groaned collectively, students dragging out sheets of paper. Dalton's eyes landed on Dakota again, and the faint smile returned. "Especially you, Norris. This will be interesting." The quiz was difficult, but not impossible. Dakota moved through it carefully, answering each question with quiet certainty. When Dalton collected the papers, his fingers paused on Dakota's sheet a fraction longer than the others, as though already preparing to twist it into another weapon. The next day, the results came back. Dalton read the scores aloud, calling out names one by one. Most were average, a few were high, several were failing. Then he came to Dakota. "Norris," Dalton said, his voice slow and deliberate. 65. The class buzzed with laughter and whispers. "Guess Daddy's fame doesn't make you a genius," someone muttered. Dakota sat still, though his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He knew his answers had been correct. He had studied, had written clearly, had nothing to be ashamed of. But Dalton's word was final. To challenge him would be useless. Dalton placed the stack of papers on his desk and folded his hands. "Let that be a lesson to everyone. Don't assume you can coast on a name. Names don't pass tests. Work does." He glanced at Dakota one last time, and the smirk that followed was sharper than any slap. The room erupted again, and Dakota felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him. They weren't mocking his intelligence. They were mocking the idea that he could stand against Dalton and win. The teacher had shown them that even the Norris name meant nothing here. When the bell rang, Dakota walked out slowly, the voices of his classmates trailing behind him. He heard their laughter, their jokes, their mocking impressions. He didn't respond. He moved with the same calm as always, but inside he felt the battle lines deepening. Dalton had gone beyond teasing. This was war, and the classroom had become his arena. Yet even as the pressure mounted, Dakota refused to tell his father. Not because he didn't trust him, but because he believed he had to face this trial himself. If he could not stand firm under the weight of humiliation, then what kind of strength did he truly have? He would endure. He would hold his silence, and he would wait, no matter how much it burned. The atmosphere around him thickened with each passing day. The laughter of students grew sharper, the whispers more confident, the smirk on Dalton's face more triumphant. Dakota bore it all, his silence a wall no one could climb. But walls could be battered, and even the strongest could crack if the storm was relentless enough. And the storm was only beginning. The tension in the school settled into something constant, like a low hum that never went away. By the time Dakota had been there 2 weeks, his place in the classroom was defined not by who he was, but by the shadow Dalton had built around him. The laughter no longer needed prompting. The students had grown used to expecting it. A single glance from their teacher was enough to set off whispers, and every time Dakota's name was called, the room sharpened into anticipation. It had become a ritual, cruel in its predictability. That morning, the history classroom smelled faintly of coffee and chalk dust. Students shuffled in lazily, half awake, their voices low. Dakota entered quietly as always, taking his seat in the middle of the room. He had begun to notice how even his silence carried weight now. How the lack of reaction seemed to irritate Dalton more than anything else. But the man was relentless. He would not let silence stand. "Mr. Norris," Dalton's voice cut through the room before the first minute of class had even begun. "Why don't you come to the board and show us what you know about last night's reading?" Dakota rose without hesitation, carrying his notebook, his expression calm. He wrote carefully on the board, outlining key points of the chapter, his handwriting neat and steady. For a brief moment, there was no sound but the scratch of chalk. Some students watched with mild interest, others with smirks, already expecting the moment to turn sour. When he finished, Dalton stepped closer, studying the board. He tapped his finger against one sentence. "And this is what you call analysis?" His voice dripped with mock disbelief. "This isn't original thought. This is parroting. You could have copied it from the first paragraph of the textbook." The class laughed on cue, though many hadn't even read the assignment themselves. Dakota set the chalk down and returned to his seat without answering. Inside, he could feel the heat rise in his chest, but he buried it. To argue was to lose. Dalton, however, wasn't finished. He raised his voice slightly, enough to ensure everyone heard. "Do you see, class? This is what happens when you rely on a name instead of real work. Norris here thinks his father's reputation can get him through. But in this classroom, we deal in reality, not myths." Another round of laughter followed. Phones appeared again, angled just low enough to avoid notice. Snippets of Dakota's humiliation would soon find their way across the cafeteria, maybe even online. It had become entertainment. That evening at home, Dakota stood in the garage, his fists wrapped in cloth, the punching bag swinging heavily under his strikes. Each hit landed with precision, not wild anger, but the rhythm of someone releasing pressure before it broke him. He remembered his father's words, spoken years ago in the dojo. "Control is strength. The first man to lose his temper is the first man to lose the fight." Those words were his anchor, though each day in Dalton's classroom made them harder to hold on to. The next week, Dalton's cruelty reached a new height. During a review session, he fired questions at random students. Most stumbled, mumbling half-correct answers. But when it came to Dakota, Dalton's tone changed. "Mr. Norris," he said, his voice sharp, "explain the economic policies that led to the collapse we discussed yesterday." Dakota answered smoothly, breaking the topic into clear points. The room fell into a brief silence, the kind that comes when someone cannot deny the truth of what's been said. For a moment, Dakota almost believed he had turned the tide, but then Dalton chuckled softly. "Well rehearsed," he said, "but notice, class, how his answer sounds like a speech, not a thought." This is memorization, not intelligence. The silence broke into laughter again, crueler this time because it followed competence rather than failure. Dakota sat down, his fist tight in his lap. He had done everything right, yet Dalton had still twisted it. That was the man's true power, not in exposing mistakes, but in turning strengths into weaknesses. It wasn't long before the rest of the school followed the pattern. In the cafeteria, whispers trailed behind Dakota's steps. He's not that smart. His dad's the real fighter, not him. At the lockers, jokes slipped into the air like arrows. Hey, Norris, show us the roundhouse kick. They weren't creative, but they didn't need to be. Their weight came from repetition. One afternoon, as Dakota gathered books from his locker, two boys laughed loudly a few feet away. One mimicked a fighting pose, pretending to throw clumsy kicks, while the other doubled over in fake laughter. Dakota closed his locker quietly and walked past them, not even glancing their way. The laughter followed him down the hall. That night he trained harder than usual. Sweat poured down his face, his muscles burning with effort. He struck the bag with combinations his father had drilled into him since childhood. Not out of anger, but out of the need to remind himself who he really was beneath the noise. His silence in the classroom was not weakness, though Dalton wanted everyone to believe it was. It was restraint, and restraint was harder than any fight. Still, the strain was real. Each day he carried the weight alone, never telling his father, never seeking help. Pride demanded that he stand on his own. Dalton, emboldened by the ease with which the students followed his lead, pushed further. He began handing back assignments with red marks scrawled across the pages. Needs more clarity. Weak argument. Does not meet expectations. The comments were vague, unhelpful, deliberately crafted to humiliate rather than instruct. Dakota knew his work was strong, better than many who received higher marks. But Dalton's grading was no longer about education. It was about control. One day when Dalton returned a paper with another undeserved low score, Dakota lingered at his desk long after the bell rang. He stared at the mark, at the ink circling sentences that were not mistakes, and felt the weight pressing down on him. A shadow passed over his desk, and he looked up to see Dalton standing there. "Do you understand now?" the teacher asked quietly, so that only Dakota could hear. "You are not special here. You will never be special here. Remember that." Dalton walked away, leaving Dakota alone with the paper. For the first time, the silence he wore like armor felt heavy instead of strong. He folded the paper slowly, slipped it into his notebook, and rose from his seat. His steps were steady, but inside the storm was gathering. The school around him buzzed with its usual chaos, voices echoing in the halls, lockers slamming, laughter spilling out of classrooms. But for Dakota, the world had narrowed to a single truth. Dalton was no longer just mocking him for sport. He was trying to break him completely, and the rest of the school, whether through laughter or silence, was letting him. Still, Dakota said nothing at home. When his father asked about school, he gave short, measured answers. "It's fine. It's just school." He smiled when he needed to, nodded when expected. But later, alone in the garage, his fists found the heavy bag again, his strike sharper than before, the rhythm almost desperate. The sound echoed into the night, each impact carrying all the words he refused to speak. The pressure had become unbearable, but Dakota endured it with the same discipline that had been carved into him since childhood. He believed he could withstand it, that his silence was enough. Yet deep down he knew the truth. Storms do not fade because you ignore them. They build, they swell, and eventually they break. And when this one broke, it would not be quiet. The days stretched on in a rhythm that felt both predictable and unbearable. Each morning, Dakota walked into the building with his usual calm. Each afternoon, he left with the same quiet resolve. From the outside, it seemed as if nothing had changed. He was still steady, still silent, still composed. But inside, the weight of Dalton's cruelty was beginning to carve deeper lines. What had started as sarcasm had grown into a system, a daily ritual of public humiliation that fed on the laughter of the class. Dalton had built a theater, and Dakota had become his unwilling actor. By the time March settled in, The air in the classroom felt heavy before lessons even began. Students arrived eager for the show, their phones half hidden, ready to capture the next barb or mocking moment. The cruelty had stopped being shocking. It had become routine, like the ringing of the bell or the scraping of chairs against the floor. And that was the most dangerous part. Humiliation had turned into entertainment. One morning, Dalton strode into the classroom with a cup of coffee steaming in his hand. His face carried that same sly smirk that meant he was already thinking ahead, already shaping the next scene in his ongoing performance. Dakota sat at his desk, his notebook open, his pen poised to write. He looked no different than he had on the first day. Tall, calm, focused. But beneath that exterior, his patience was stretched thin, like glass ready to crack. Dalton began his lecture with the usual rhythm, weaving through a lesson about revolutions and power. His voice carried authority, and his words should have been enough to hold the class. But again and again, his eyes flicked to Dakota, as though waiting for the right moment. The students could feel it too. Whispers stirred in the back rows. Glances darted across the room, everyone anticipating what was to come. When Dalton finally called on Dakota, the silence in the room tightened. "Mr. Norris," he said, his tone sharp with theatrical weight, "stand up and tell the class why revolutions fail." Dakota rose slowly, his expression calm, his voice even. He explained with clarity, drawing from the reading, breaking down the collapse of leadership, the fractures in unity, the hunger for power that outstripped ideals. His answer was measured, thoughtful, correct. For a moment, a flicker of respect seemed to pass through the room, but Dalton leaned back against his desk, smirking. "Is that what your father taught you at the dinner table? Sounds rehearsed. Sounds like someone pretending to understand." The laughter came instantly. Phones were lifted again, capturing Dakota's stillness, his lack of reaction. He stood for a moment longer, then sat down, his face unchanged. Yet inside, he could feel the storm pressing harder. The next day, Dalton escalated again. He returned essays to the class, passing them out one by one. When he reached Dakota, he held the paper high before dropping it onto the desk with a loud slap. 60, he said loudly, for sloppy reasoning and lack of originality. The class snickered. Dakota kept his hands folded, staring at the red marks across his paper. His arguments had been precise, his writing careful. He knew the grade was not a reflection of his work, but of Dalton's need to control the narrative. And once again, he said nothing. Dalton's power grew with each silence. He fed on it, twisting every pause into proof that Dakota was weak, that he could be bent and broken without a word. But the truth was different. Dakota's silence was not weakness, it was restraint. The problem was that no one else in the room could see it. By Friday, the tension had reached its breaking point. The classroom was thick with anticipation, the students restless, waiting for Dalton to deliver something they could whisper about for weeks. And Dalton, sensing their hunger, had prepared something crueler than ever. The lesson had barely begun when he set his coffee cup down on the edge of the desk. The steam curled into the air, carrying the bitter smell of roasted beans. Dalton lectured for a few minutes, pacing the front of the room, weaving his points with ease. But all the while, his hand hovered near the cup, his eyes cutting to Dakota again and again. The students noticed. The whispers spread. They knew something was coming. Dalton's words slowed, his tone sharpening. He stepped closer to Dakota's desk, the cup of coffee in his hand now. "Let's see how calm you really are, Mr. Norris," he said quietly, though loud enough for the class to hear. The room froze. Phones rose instantly, cameras ready. Every student leaned forward, hungry for the moment. Dalton tilted the cup, and in one smooth, deliberate motion, he poured the steaming coffee over Dakota's head. The liquid splashed across his hair, dripping down his face, soaking his shirt. Gasps and laughter exploded in the room, the noise deafening. Some shouted in disbelief, others cackled with glee. The phones captured it all, the triumphant smirk on Dalton's face, the stunned silence that followed before the eruption of sound. Dakota sat perfectly still, his fists clenched beneath the desk, his chest burned with the heat of humiliation, but his face remained calm. Slowly he reached for his sleeve, wiped the coffee from his eyes, and lifted his head. His gaze met Dalton's with a steadiness that cut through the chaos around them. "You think this makes you strong?" Dakota said softly. The words were quiet, but they carried. The room hushed, the laughter faltering. Dalton's smirk flickered for the first time, but he covered it with a sneer. It makes you nothing, he snapped, though his voice lacked the same weight. The class watched, their phones still raised, but the energy had shifted. For the first time, Dalton looked unsure. He had gone further than ever before, and yet his victim still refused to break. The silence that followed was heavier than any laughter could be. Dakota stood slowly, his clothes dripping, the smell of coffee filling the room. He gathered his notebook and pen, his movements calm, controlled. He did not raise his voice, did not strike back. He only looked at Dalton one last time, his eyes steady, cold without rage. Then he sat down again, as though nothing had happened. The room erupted once more, but this time the laughter was thinner, more uneasy. Some students looked at their screens with hesitation, unsure if they had just recorded a victory or a disaster. Dalton tried to recover, tried to laugh along, but the sound rang hollow. For the first time, the class could sense the fragility of his power. Dakota said nothing more. He sat in silence, dripping with coffee, waiting for the bell to ring. And when it finally did, he rose with calm dignity, walking out of the room without looking back. The laughter followed him into the hall, but so did something else. A quiet, unspoken realization that no matter how much Dalton tried, he could not shatter him. The storm had broken over his head, but still he stood. What Dakota did not know was that this was the moment that would echo far beyond the walls of the classroom. The students who had filmed the scene would spread it within minutes. The school would buzz with it, the district would whisper about it, and the clip would play on countless phones. Dalton had tried to end the game with a show of dominance, but instead he had set the stage for something he could not control. And though Dakota walked out that day in silence, still carrying his burden alone, the tide was already beginning to shift. For storms, once broken, do not fade quietly. They grow louder and their echoes demand reckoning. The silence that followed Dakota into the hallway after the coffee incident was heavier than any noise could have been. The students who had laughed a moment earlier now trailed behind him, whispering to one another, their phones already glowing with captured video. The image of hot coffee dripping down his face, his calm refusal to react. And Dalton's smug grin had burned itself into the memory of everyone present. For most of them, it was entertainment. For Dakota, it was yet another scar added to the growing weight he carried in silence. He walked steadily, his wet clothes clinging to him, but his steps did not falter. Each stride was deliberate, each breath even. He had endured worse in training. He had endured harsher lessons on control, on patience, on never surrendering the inner ground. But what pressed hardest against him was not the heat of humiliation. It was the knowledge that Dalton would not stop, that every boundary crossed only encouraged him to push further. At home that night, Dakota showered away the bitter smell of coffee, scrubbed his skin until the sting faded, then wrapped his hands and began his training. The garage filled with the rhythm of strikes against the heavy bag, each impact sharp and precise. He moved through the drills his father had taught him, balance first, then power, never sacrificing control. His fists flew, his breath timed with each strike, sweat streaming down his body. Yet when he stopped, when the silence returned, the weight pressed in again. He thought of his father just a few rooms away, unaware of what his son was enduring. It would be so easy to tell him, to hand the burden over, to let the man who had faced countless battles carry this one too. But Dakota did not. His pride, his sense of honor, told him this was his trial to face. He went to bed that night with his body tired, his mind restless, and his silence unbroken. The next morning, the video had already spread through the entire school. Screens lit up in every hallway, groups gathered in tight circles, laughter breaking out as Dalton's joke replayed again and again. To many, it was proof of his power. To some, it was unsettling, because the boy they saw in the video had not reacted the way they expected. He had not raged, he had not fought, he had not even shouted. He had stared straight through the humiliation, and in that calmness, there was something unshakable. Dalton walked into class that day taller than usual, basking in the attention. He had cemented his authority in front of the entire school. The students greeted him with snickers and approving glances, but beneath that surface, small cracks had begun to appear. A few students who watched the video again in private had felt an unease they could not name. The laughter in the clip seemed forced, the victory hollow. Some whispered that Dalton had gone too far, though not loudly enough to change anything. Dakota entered the classroom as calmly as ever, though his shirt was fresh and his hair clean. He sat in his usual seat, opened his notebook, and ignored the snickers. Dalton glanced at him, waiting for a flicker of shame, a crack in the armor, but none came. For a moment, the teacher's smirk faltered before he smoothed it over again. The hours dragged. The tension between them was no longer hidden, but a current that pulled everyone in the room along with it. The students felt it, restless in their seats, whispering to one another during breaks. They knew this could not continue forever. Something had to give. And then, on a day when no one expected it, the door opened. It was a Thursday afternoon, the middle of an otherwise ordinary lesson. The room was dim with the late light of winter, the air warm with the hum of the radiator. Dalton was pacing the front of the classroom, speaking about the failures of leaders in history, his words sharp as always, when the door swung open without warning. The room fell silent. Conversation stopped. Chairs froze in place. In the doorway stood a figure every student recognized instantly, though most had never dreamed they would see him in person. Chuck Norris stepped inside, his presence filling the room before he had even spoken a word. He wore simple clothes, a jacket over a plain shirt, but it was not his clothing that captured the room. It was the weight of his presence. His eyes swept across the students, steady and piercing, before landing on his son. Dakota sat tall at his desk, not shocked, not startled, only still. Their eyes met, and in that single moment of silence, a lifetime of unspoken understanding passed between them. Dalton's face drained of color. The smirk he wore so easily collapsed, leaving behind only a thin line pressed tight with sudden unease. He had built his entire performance on the back of Dakota's silence, on the assumption that the boy would never speak, never fight back. But now the father stood before him, the very man he had mocked indirectly, the symbol of everything he had tried to use against Dakota. The students stared wide-eyed, their phones momentarily forgotten. They felt the shift immediately. Power no longer belonged to Dalton. It radiated from the man at the door, quiet but undeniable. Chuck Norris stepped further into the room. His movements calm, deliberate. He did not raise his voice, did not scowl, did not make a single threat. He only looked at Dalton, and the weight of that gaze was enough. Dalton cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Norris," he said, his voice brittle, we weren't expecting—" Chuck raised a hand, silencing him without a word. His attention shifted briefly to the students, then back to Dakota. The message was clear to everyone. He knew. He had seen or heard enough to understand. And he did not need Dalton's explanations. Dakota stood slowly, his chair scraping softly against the floor. He met his father's eyes again, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed the weight of his silence to lift just slightly. His father's presence was enough. He did not need to speak to defend himself anymore. The classroom, once filled with cruel laughter, now sat in stunned stillness. The same students who had cheered Dalton's humiliation only days before shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The phones that had been so quick to record humiliation now hung uselessly at their sides. No one wanted to raise them. No one wanted to be the one to laugh now. Dalton tried to recover, forcing a weak smile. "It was just a bit of fun," he said, though his voice cracked. "Nothing serious. The boy understands." Chuck's gaze did not waver. He did not reply immediately, but the silence he left was more powerful than any words. Dalton's smile faltered further, his shoulders sagging under the weight of shame. Finally, Chuck spoke, his voice calm, low, but cutting through the room with absolute authority. "Respect is not a game. Humiliation is not teaching. If this is what you call education, then you've already failed." The words struck harder than any fist could have. The students flinched. Dalton swallowed hard, and the air itself seemed to hold still. Chuck turned his eyes once more to his son. Dakota nodded almost imperceptibly, and in that exchange, the bond between them was made visible to everyone present. The boy who had endured in silence had not been abandoned. The man who had taught him discipline and control had arrived, not to fight his battles for him, but to remind the world that dignity and strength do not go unseen. Chuck placed a hand lightly on Dakota's shoulder as he passed. Together they walked toward the door, leaving Dalton standing in the wreckage of his own arrogance. The class remained frozen, the echo of Chuck's words hanging in the air long after they were gone. When the door closed behind them, the silence lingered. Dalton looked around at his students, but there was no laughter waiting to rescue him this time. The smirks were gone, the approval vanished. He was alone, and for the first time, the balance of power had shifted completely. The walk out of the classroom was slower than usual. Dakota carried his books at his side, his father's hand resting lightly on his shoulder, guiding him through the silent corridor. The noise of the school seemed to vanish around them, as though every whisper had been swallowed by the weight of what had just happened. Behind the closed door, a room full of students still sat in stunned quiet, and a teacher who once ruled with mockery stood stripped of his power. For the first time in weeks, Dakota felt the heaviness lift. Not completely, not as if the scars had disappeared, but enough for his shoulders to feel lighter. Chuck said nothing until they reached the end of the hall. His silence was not the kind that pressed down, but the kind that gave space. When they finally stopped near the glass doors that looked out onto the schoolyard, Chuck turned to face his son. His eyes were calm, his expression steady, yet behind it was something else. Understanding, disappointment not in Dakota, but in what had been done to him, and pride in how he had endured. "You carried it longer than you should have," Chuck said at last, his voice low but firm. "But you carried it well." Dakota nodded, his jaw tightening. He had kept it from him for so long, convinced he had to fight it alone, convinced that silence was strength. And yet here his father stood, proving that some battles were not meant to be fought without witness. He didn't answer, but the words filled the space between them anyway. They stepped outside, the cold air wrapping around them, sharper than the stale warmth of the classroom. For Dakota, it was a kind of cleansing, as though the sting of coffee, the laughter of classmates, the endless weight of humiliation were being left behind with every step away from the building. He breathed deeper than he had in weeks, his chest rising freely. Back inside, Dalton sat at his desk long after the students had been dismissed. His hands trembled slightly as he shuffled papers that no longer mattered. He tried to convince himself that he still held authority, that the humiliation he had inflicted was justified, that he had only been teaching lessons about strength and discipline. But no matter how many excuses he rehearsed in his mind, he could not silence the image of Chuck Norris standing in his classroom, nor the echo of his words. Respect is not a game. Dalton had built his power on laughter, but laughter was fickle. It had deserted him the moment someone stronger had walked into the room, not stronger in fists or in fury, but in dignity. And that was a kind of strength Dalton could never imitate. For the students, the story spread through the school faster than anything else ever had. By the end of the day, every corner buzzed with retellings. The coffee incident was still remembered, but now it was overshadowed by something bigger. They spoke of the silence that had hung in the room when Chuck appeared, of the way Dalton had shrunk under a single look, of how Dakota had walked out beside his father without a single word of revenge. Phones that once replayed clips of humiliation now carried whispers of awe. "He didn't even fight back," one student said. "He didn't need to," another replied. And beneath their words lay the recognition that something in their world had shifted. Dakota returned home that evening with his father. The house felt safe in a way the school never had. He set his books down on the table, washed the last traces of coffee from his hair, and sat in the living room where his father waited. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence was not heavy. It was comfortable, filled with mutual respect. Finally, Dakota broke it. "I didn't want to bring it to you," he said quietly. "I thought if I couldn't handle it myself, then I wasn't strong enough." Chuck leaned forward, his hands resting on his knees. "Strength isn't about carrying everything alone. It's about knowing when to stand, when to endure, and when to let someone stand with you. You weren't weak for keeping quiet. You were disciplined. But don't mistake silence for solitude. You're not alone in this world. You'll never be alone. The words sank deep into Dakota, not as a lesson spoken for the first time, but as a truth he had needed to hear now more than ever. For weeks he had believed that his silence was his only shield. Now he understood it was his weapon. But it was not the only one. The bond with his father was another, and it was stronger than anything Dalton had tried to strip away. The next day when Dakota returned to school, the atmosphere was different. Students still whispered, but the tone had changed. Some avoided his eyes, ashamed of their laughter. Others nodded slightly in acknowledgement, as if admitting they had misjudged him. Even those who had been loudest in their mockery now kept their distance, uncertain of where they stood. Dakota did not gloat. He did not seek their apologies. He walked the halls with the same calm stride as always, his silence intact, his composure unshaken. But this time, the silence was not mistaken for weakness. It was recognized for what it was: strength. Dalton tried to resume his routine, but the weight of what had happened clung to him. Each time he called on Dakota, his voice faltered just slightly, the smirk never quite reaching his eyes. The students sensed it too. The man who had seemed untouchable now appeared fragile, his authority broken. He could no longer wield laughter like a weapon because laughter had turned on him. Respect, once lost, could not be reclaimed with sarcasm. It had to be earned, and Dalton had none left to give. By the end of the week, the balance of the entire school had shifted. Dakota had not thrown a punch, had not shouted, had not lashed out. Yet he had done what no one else had managed. He had ended the reign of humiliation. He had shown that dignity was stronger than mockery, that patience could outlast cruelty, and that silence, when rooted in discipline, was louder than any insult. One afternoon, as he walked across the courtyard with the late sun casting long shadows, a younger student hurried up beside him. The boy looked nervous, clutching his books tightly. "I just wanted to say," he murmured, "what you did. It helped me. I used to think I had to laugh with them, or they'd turn on me too. But now, I think I can stop." Dakota glanced at him, his expression calm, his eyes steady. He gave a single nod, and the boy seemed to stand a little taller as he hurried off. It was a small thing, but it mattered. The ripple of change had begun. That evening, Dakota stood once more in the garage, his hands wrapped, the heavy bag swaying in front of him. He struck it with measured precision, his movements controlled, his breath steady. But this time, the strikes did not carry the weight of frustration. They carried the rhythm of someone who had endured, who had walked through fire and emerged intact. He felt stronger, not because the humiliation had ended, but because he had refused to let it break him. When he stepped back, his father was standing at the doorway, watching quietly. "You did well," Chuck said. "Not because you fought, but because you knew when not to." Dakota smiled faintly, a rare expression that carried more weight than words. "I learned from the best," he replied. Chuck walked forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. "The world will always have men like Dalton, but it will also always need men who can face them without becoming them. That's your strength, Dakota. Don't ever forget it." Summing. The night settled softly around them, the air cool, the stars beginning to pierce the darkness. Inside the garage, father and son stood together, bound not just by blood, but by a shared understanding of what true strength meant. It was not found in humiliation or in power over others. It was found in respect, in discipline, in the courage to endure without losing yourself. And though Dalton's voice would still echo faintly in the halls of the school for a while longer, his power was gone. What remained was the quiet certainty that respect, once shown, could change everything. Dakota walked forward into that certainty, carrying with him the dignity that no amount of cruelty had managed to take away. The reign of humiliation had ended. The lesson of respect had begun. Don't stop here. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss the next story. Check out our other videos for even more shocking twists, and share this one with your friends so they can see what really happened.